What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back, and thank you for joining me today as we do another stellar Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. Folks, in this week's recap, we will be going over a couple of graded cards from Destined Rivals. That's right, graded cards have already hit the market for this set. And we'll also be going over several insane vintage card sales. A lot of these cards have hit new record prices. So as always, please stay tuned to the very end. You're not going to want to miss today's recap. Folks, quick shout out to today's video sponsor. It is the one and only lowpopping.com, your source for investment-worthy Pokemon cards. If you are a collector of high-end graded Pokemon cards, you need to go check out lowpopping.com. There you will find a plethora of PSA, CGC, and BGS graded Pokemon cards and sealed product spanning the entire Pokemon TCG. They have recently refreshed their inventory with new Pokemon card grails, and many of these cards aren't available anywhere else. And if you see something that you must have for your collection, but you don't have the cash on hand, you can easily trade for or make offers on just about anything you see. Lowpopping.com is a must for anyone in the market for high-end Pokemon card grails. I will put a link to the website in the description of this video. Please support the channel by checking them out and let me know what you pick up. Alright folks, let's start this recap off with some Destined Rivals, starting off with the booster boxes. How much does a Destined Rivals booster box go for in auction? Well, here is one that sold for $251. Now we're going to take a look at a few raw card sales. Here is a Team Rocket's Houndoom that sold this week as a raw copy for $40, along with this Team Rocket's Moltres EX Special Illustration Rare that sold for $180.50. Here is a Ethan's Ho-Oh EX that sold for $197.50. And then here we have a couple of graded cards. Here is a PSA 10 Cynthia's Garchomp EX SIR that sold for $820. And then of course we had the Team Rocket's Mewtwo EX Special Illustration Rare that sold as a PSA 10, one of the first copies to sell, for $2,600. And let's not forget the Japanese version of this card had a BGS 10 Black Label sale of $6,280 this week. We saw a couple more Black Label cards come by. Here is a Black Label Japanese Lily's Clefairy EX that sold for $2,181, along with this Giratina V-Star from Crown Zenith. Got the Black Label and sold for $3,050 this week. Here we have the trio from Scarlet and Violet 151, the Venusaur, the Charizard, and the Blastoise, all in PSA 10, sold for $1,175. And considering not that long ago the Charizard by itself was going for nearly $1,000, I think this is a pretty good deal. What do you think? Up next we saw the Pikachu Van Gogh promo card. Now the PSA 10s have been selling for between $800 and $900. However, we saw a BGS 10 pristine example come by, and it sold for $5,500 this week. And one of these days, we're going to see a Black Label copy of this card come by an auction. I just know it. And it's going to go for a mind-blowing amount. Here we have a CGC 10 pristine Metal Charizard from the Celebrations UPC. This is one of the old label CGC 10s, sold for $2,711, while a new CGC 10 pristine label Charizard sold for $3,350, while a PSA 10 copy sold for $3,600 this week. Here we have a couple of cards from the XY era. Here is a Mega Lucario EX promo, sold as a PSA 10 for $875. From Breakpoint, we saw this Mega Gyarados EX sell for $840. Here is a Mega Charizard EX from Generations, sold as a PSA 10 for $1,675. Here is a Secret Rare Full Art Mewtwo EX from Breakthrough that sold as a PSA 10 for $1,905. Here we have a CGC 10 Pristine Ancient Origins Primal Groudon that sold for $2,252 this week. And up next, folks, this card sold last week, but I guess it ended up being relisted. It is the Full Art Dialga EX from Phantom Forces that sold as a PSA 10 for $10,450. And I did confirm that this card was in fact paid for this week. A couple of Japanese cards came by. Here is a PSA 10 2014 Pikachu Battle Festa card that sold for $3,251. Here is a CGC 10 pristine Chinese Pikachu card sold this week for $2,350. Here is another Chinese Mew EX card that sold as a raw copy for $7,300, while a CGC 10 copy sold for $9,749, and then a PSA 10 sold for $14,950 this week. And then lastly, for our modern cards, we have this Pikachu Art Academy promo card that sold as a PSA 10 for a whopping $30,100 this week. Getting into some amazing vintage sales, here we have a PSA 10 first edition Gengar from Fossil that sold for $6,505 US. Here is a BGS 9.5 first edition Dark Charizard from Team Rocket, sold for $4,050. Here's a CGC 10 Pristine First Edition Blaine's Charizard from Gym Challenge, sold for $7,119. Also from Gym Challenge was this First Edition Rockets Zapdos, sold for $1,386, and then again for $1,433. Up next was this PSA 10 First Edition Umbreon from Neo Discovery that sold for $10,849 US this week. A couple of bangers from Neo Revelation. Here's a first edition Entei as a PSA 10 sold for $9,400, while the first edition PSA 10 Suicune sold for $12,250. We saw several cards from Neo Destiny come by. Here's a first edition Dark Ampharos that sold for $1,913. Here's a first edition Dark Houndoom that sold for $1,775. Here's a first edition Celebi that sold for $3,025. An unlimited Shining Charizard that sold for $4,988, while the first edition example sold for $17,250. And then we saw the reverse holo PSA 10 Legendary Collection Charizard come by that sold for a staggering $27,995. Up next, we have several cards from the E-Series. Here is a Pidgeot from Expedition that sold for $1,868. Also from Expedition was this Holo Raichu that sold for $1,225, and this Tyranitar that sold for $4,650. Speaking of Tyranitar, here's the one from Aquapolis that sold for $4,550. The Espeon from Aquapolis sold for $3,400, while this Umbreon from Aquapolis sold for $6,234 US. From Skyridge, we saw this Holo Alakazam sell for $2,050. This Holo Arcanine that sold for $2,800. And then we saw every crystal card come by in PSA 10 except the Lugia and the Charizard. Here's a Crystal Kabutops sold for $2,264. The Crystal Crobat sold for $4,623. The Crystal Celebi sold for $4,950. And the Nidoking sold for $6,850 this week. And then the Ho-Oh sold for a whopping $9,200 as a PSA 10. A couple of very expensive EX cards. Here's a PSA 10 Black Star Promo Rayquaza EX that sold for $5,100 this week, along with this Lugia EX from Unseen Forces that sold for $9,500. Here we have a PSA 10 Gold Star Pikachu from EX Holon Phantoms that sold for $19,422 US. And then here, folks, is a Tag 10 Gold Star Mewtwo, also from EX Holon Phantoms, that sold for $10,950. Up next, we have this Level X Gengar from Platinum Arceus that sold as a PSA 10 for $9,100. From Call of Legends, we saw this Holo Rayquaza sell as a PSA 10 for $1,875. And then a couple of booster box sales to finish up on eBay. Here is a Sun and Moon Cosmic Eclipse box that sold for $2,447. Here is an Ancient Origins booster box that sold for $3,700. A Celestial Storm booster box that sold for $2,347. Another Ancient Origins booster box that sold for $3,583. Here we have a case of Scarlet and Violet Prismatic Evolution Super Premium Collection boxes. So 4 boxes total, sold for $911. And then we saw 2 booster box cases of Unbroken Bonds. This one here sold for $9,665. The other one sold for $10,569. And then last but not least, we saw this unlimited base set booster box that sold in auction for $19,942. On to the Fanatics Collect Weekly auction block, we have this full art Primal Kyogre from Ancient Origins sold as a PSA 10 for $1,920. Here is a Moonbryon VMAX that kind of bounced back, hitting closer to $3,000 this week, selling as a PSA 10 for $2,760, while the BGS 10 copy of this card sold for an even $3,000. Here is a PSA 10 Reverse Hollow Alakazam from Legendary Collection, sold for $3,960. Here is a Charizard Hollow from Diamond and Pearl Secret Wonders, sold for $4,200. Here is a PSA 10 First Edition Dark Blastoise from Team Rocket, sold this week for $5,760. Here's the Japanese 20th Anniversary Festa Pikachu card, sold as a PSA 10 for $13,200. Here's a CGC 10 Pristine Full Art Mario Pikachu, sold for $13,800. Here we have a 2015 Japanese XY Promo Art Academy Pikachu card that sold for $19,200 as a PSA 10. And then lastly on Fanatics, we saw this PSA 10 Japanese Gold Star Rayquaza, sold for $19,800. And then just a couple of sales on alt auctions. We have this PSA 10 15th Anniversary Japanese Zekrom Full Art card, sold for $6,163. We saw a couple of poncho-wearing Pikachu cards. Here's a BGS 10 Pristine Rayquaza poncho-wearing Pikachu, sold for $6,360. Here's a PSA 10 Mega Charizard poncho-wearing Pikachu, sold for $8,460, while a BGS 10 copy sold for $7,320. And then the Black Label copy of this card blew the rest of them out of the water, selling for $22,075. And then we saw 3 of these 2002 Japanese promo Battle Road Summer cards. Here's the number 3 trainer card, sold for $8,566. The number 2 trainer card sold for $10,088. While the number 1 trainer sold for $17,266. Which brings me to the auction of the week, and it would have to be this 2009 Pokemon National Championship Wonder Platinum card in PSA 10, sold for $51,000. That's all I got for you, folks, and I think that's enough. Let me know what you thought of these auctions in the comments below. As always, I look forward to hearing from you. That's all I got for today, and I will catch you all in my next one.